All right, this is our lecture for chapter 21. I know we canceled class tonight, but I wanted to go ahead and record this because it's a really short chapter. That way we can stay on schedule with our test, which is going to be next week. Uh, if we put off the test, if we rearranged our schedule, it was going to be a real headache around the time finals came. So it's better just to go ahead and knock this out. And you can, since this is recorded, you can obviously go back and rewatch it and take notes however you want to. Just a quick heads up, the program that I'm using to record this, it's going to limit me to like 15-minute videos. So what that means is I'm probably going to have several parts to this lecture. So don't stress out. This is a shorter lecture. But if you open it up and you see that there's like 5 parts to it, that doesn't mean it's a really long lecture. It just means that they're 15 minutes. So you can take breaks in between or however you want to do that. All right, so chapter 21 is on water, electrolyte, and acid-base balance. This is going to match up really nicely with the urinary chapter that we just did. Our kidneys are obviously going to be involved with regulating water and other substances in our body fluid. So we're just going to kind of look into a little bit more detail. All right, so starting off, it talks about body water, and in general, this is obviously going to vary depending on your size, a little bit by gender and things like that too. But it says that the body, all of the water that's inside your body is about 40 liters. So that's a decent amount of water inside of our body. We know that we're made up of over 2/3 water, so it makes sense that we're going to have a large amount of water in our body. When we break that down, though, it says that 2/3 of the water inside of our body is intracellular, and what that means is it's inside of our cells. So we know we're made up of cells. The inside, the cytoplasm, the liquid part, that's where a lot of our water is going to be found. And then the other third is extracellular, so it's outside of our cells. We're going to look more specifically about where that comes from, but that's going to be like things inside of our interstitial tissue fluid, so the fluid that's in between our tissue. Also in like your joints, you have synovial fluid. Our membranes have fluid. So that's a lot of that fluid is on the outside of our cells. It also breaks down, it compares males and females. So males are 63% water and females are 52. The reason behind that, it says males typically have more muscle, and muscle contains a greater deal of water than most other tissue types. Again, this is obviously a generalization, so that's not always the case. But in general, males are going to have more muscle mass, and that muscle has a lot of water. The big thing with that is your muscles need a lot of blood flow, and the plasma inside of our blood is made up of mostly water. The other thing is, if you look at it as like a ratio, muscle has a decent amount of water inside of it, and adipose or fat tissue, believe it or not, it actually does not have much water on the inside of it. And typically, if, again, speaking in general, but if you think about the female body, there's a lot more adipose deposits, so breast development and things like that. It's got a lot of fat in it. So that's going to have less water. So that's why males typically have more water than females. All right, so we're going to break that down a little bit further. Intracellular fluid, that is the fluid within our cell membranes. So that's inside of our cells. And that's about 2/3. Extracellular fluid is any fluid inside of your body that is not inside your cell membrane. So it's outside of the cells. And then these other 4 parts, that just breaks down how those, where some of that fluid can be found. So interstitial fluid is fluid within the tissue spaces. So basically all of the things in between your cells that have fluid, that would be interstitial fluid. Blood plasma is the fluid within our blood vessels. So we know that from the blood chapter at the beginning of the semester. Our blood has red blood cells and white blood cells, but the liquid that they're all floating around in is plasma, and the huge majority of plasma is water or fluid. Lymph, so the fluid that we return from our tissue as it's going back to our cardiovascular system, that's lymph, and that's going to be mostly water. And then lastly, this makes up a small amount, but it's transcellular. So transcellular, it says this includes things like our cerebrospinal fluid. So the fluid in the central canal of your spinal cord and in the ventricles of your brain. Your aqueous and vitreous humor. If you remember when you may have done an eyeball dissection in Anatomy 1, and all the liquid that was inside the eye, that's the aqueous and vitreous humor, so that's mostly water. Synovial fluid is the fluid inside your joints, so think about like your knee joint and places like that. There's some fluid there. And then lastly, the serous fluid within our body cavities. Well, not lastly, but serous fluid within our body cavities. So your abdominal cavity, your thoracic cavity, there's going to be a little bit of fluid that's produced by the membranes. And then finally, the last one is fluid secretions of exocrine glands. So things like sweat glands, sebaceous glands or oil glands, there's a little bit of water associated with that also. So that's where all of the extracellular fluid could be. Now, when we're going through this, I'll try to point out a few of them, but there's some pretty good short answer type questions that are in this chapter. So that would be a pretty good one, like explain where fluid is found inside the body and explain the different types of extracellular fluid. All right. So body fluid comparison. It says our extracellular fluid, so the fluid that is outside of our cells, all of our fluid is going to have different concentrations of different substances that are dissolved inside of the fluid, but we notice a pretty significant difference on whether the fluid is inside of our cells or outside of our cells. So in extracellular fluid, we've got a really high concentration of sodium, calcium, chloride, and bicarbonate ions. All right, so sodium, calcium, chloride, and bicarbonate ions. Bicarbonate, we're going to talk about this again today, but we recently mentioned bicarbonate is used to help stabilize our pH. We'll look a lot more into that at the end of this chapter, but this was back in the respiratory chapter, so not that long ago we talked about bicarbonate as one of the ways that we carry around carbon dioxide in the blood, and that prevents our blood from getting too acidic. So that should make sense. We know that plasma is an extracellular fluid, and we know that bicarbonate ions are found inside the plasma. All right, maybe if this helps you or not, this would be an easy note for you to jot down while you're watching this lecture. Extracellular fluids, if you wanted to keep those straight, I know when we were doing the blood vessels that come off of the aorta, we had BCS, that was the brachiocephalic and cephalic and subclavian. On this one, you can remember BCCS, so kind of similar to that, BCCS. And if you write down BCCS, that lets you know the first letter of the substances that are found in extracellular fluid. So bicarbonate, calcium, chloride, and sodium is BCCS. Intracellular, we are going to have a lot of potassium, magnesium, phosphate, and sulfate. So intracellular, inside of our blood, inside of our cells, inside of the cytoplasm in our cells, a lot of potassium, magnesium, phosphate, and sulfate. So for that one, if you wanted to keep those straight, PPMS, I know it's not quite the same thing that it sounds like at first, but PPMS is going to tell you the first letter of each of the substances that are found in greater concentrations in our intracellular fluids. So again, potassium, magnesium, or PP would be potassium, phosphate, magnesium, and sulfate. All right, I know that seems like just kind of extra information right now, but later on in this chapter, we're going to talk about what some of those things do. So these dissolved substances have really important jobs. That's going to involve things like our nervous system working and our muscles being able to contract. All right, so next up is movement of fluids between compartments. So we know that we've got, this kind of shows us where all the fluid can be. Fluid can be in our plasma, it can be in the interstitial fluid, in our transcellular, intracellular, and lymph. But that fluid can pass from one place to another. So fluid is constantly moving from one place to another inside of our body. It says the net movement of fluids between compartments result in differences in hydrostatic and osmotic pressures. All right, so the way that things move around is going to be because of those two pressures, hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure. We have mentioned these before, but we'll do a quick review. And let's just look at this picture, and this is a good example. All right, so hydrostatic pressure pushes fluid out. So right here, this yellow up top, this is a blood vessel. So right here where the arrow is going out, where the arrow is going out, that is representing the blood pressure that's inside the capillary, and that pressure builds up, and the pressure is so great that it pushes some of the water out into the tissue. All right, so that's hydrostatic pressure. I think the way I've described that earlier was like if you're filling up a water balloon and that balloon gets tight because of all the water on the inside, the water that's pushing out from the inside of the balloon would be hydrostatic pressure. Same thing in our blood vessels, but in the vessels, when the hydrostatic pressure gets high enough, the fluid is going to leave the blood vessel and go into the surrounding tissue. All right, stay on the blood vessel and go over here. Some of that fluid gets pulled back in, and that's due to osmosis. So we've got a lot of dissolved particles that are inside of our blood vessels, and as we lose all of this water, it's going to get greater concentrated. You're going to have a lot of salt, a lot of other substances that are dissolved inside the blood vessel. I keep losing my cursor. I can't find it. Whoa, there we go. All right. So as the fluid is going through the blood vessel, it leaves. We're getting more and more concentrated. And then finally, the osmotic pressure gets so great that it's going to draw some of the water back into the blood vessel. Okay, so that's what we're saying. Fluid can leave, get pushed out because of hydrostatic pressure, and fluid can also be drawn back in because of osmotic pressure. All right, so the words over on the right of this diagram is actually really good. It tells us how things are moving. So fluid leaves plasma at the arteriolar end of the capillary because of outward forces of hydrostatic pressure predominates. So we got a lot of blood pressure in the arteriole, and that pressure is great enough to push the fluid out. Fluid returns to the plasma at the venular end of the capillary because of inward forces of colloid osmotic pressure predominates. So we've got enough dissolved particles that we're going to pull fluid back in. All right. Next, it says hydrostatic pressure within the interstitial spaces forces fluid into the lymph capillaries. We mentioned that in the lymphatic chapter, but what it's saying is we're pushing all of this fluid from the plasma and it's going into the tissue, to the interstitial fluid. So that builds up so much pressure inside the interstitial fluid that some of that fluid is going to get pushed into our lymphatic capillaries. All right. So from the lymphatic capillaries it goes and it returns to our cardiovascular system. All right, and then we've got an equilibrium. That means that there's equal amounts of pressure. So interstitial fluid is in equilibrium with transcellular and intracellular fluids. So fluids can move back and forth freely inside of our cells, and then also the transcellular fluid. So that's like the serous fluid or the cerebrospinal fluid and things like that. Okay, now water balance says we're looking at water balance means that the amount of water that is taken into our body every day should pretty much equal the amount of water that leaves our body every day too. All right, so that's the balance. We don't want to be adding more water than we usually have, or we don't want to be losing too much water because that could be dehydration. So it says urine production is the most important in regulation of water balance. That's the most important mechanism that we have to make sure that our fluid stays the same. So let's look through this. On the next couple slides, we're going to break it down into a little more detail. But first, over on the the left, we're going to look at the average daily intake of water. Now, this is average, and this is just a very in general term, but it's saying that we take about 2.5 liters of water in a day. That doesn't necessarily mean we drink that much, but like altogether, that's how much extra water we're adding to our body. Now, like if you're exercising or something like that, you're probably going to have to take in more. But the reason that's okay is because if you're exercising, you're sweating, so you're going to be losing more too. So let's break this down. The major way that we get fluid inside of our body is water, as in beverages. So water in beverages, about 1.5 liters a day. And that's different from person to person, but in general, about 1.5 liters. That makes up about 60% of our water intake. All right, about 30% comes from water in moist foods. That's kind of surprising at first. We know that we drink water or we drink beverages that have water, but almost half of that amount that we drink, we get almost half that much from our food also. Where it says water in moist foods, if you think of some foods like watermelon, that's probably 95% water that you're eating. So it's almost, to your body, that's almost the same as drinking when you eat something like a watermelon. Same thing for a lot of juicy fruits like oranges, grapefruit, things like that. A lot of water inside of those things. Even things like salads, we don't think of those as being juicy necessarily, but it's just plant material, and that's going to be mostly water. So fruits and vegetables, salads, that's where we get a lot of our water from. Real quick on the intake, because I'm running out of the 15-minute time for this first part, but water of metabolism is when we break down food, we can get some water from there too. So I'll describe that more in part two.